So now we'll move a little deeper into statistics, and you'll find that when we start doing the actual problems within the statistics genre of math, you're going to find there's not actually as much manipulation of numbers, but more explanation of what you're talking about. So less actual grind out, more actual understanding concepts and being able to write sentences for what we're trying to talk about. We're going to talk today about samples and studies, and there's some key terms you've got to know in order to be able to even discuss this. The first one is what's called a population, and a population is just all the numbers or members of a group of interest that you're looking at. A sample is a smaller portion of that population or a group. A random sample, when you take a random sampling of a population, it's when every member of that population has an equal chance of being selected. Systematic samples are when members from that population are taken in such a way that you're choosing by a specific interval. For instance, every fifth member of the group you're pulling out and sampling them. Self-selected sampler are people who volunteer to be in a specific small sample of a population. A convenient sample is something that's, like it says, convenient to do. It's easy to get the people or the members of your sample. And a stratified sample is when a population is divided into a subgroup and the members are then randomly selected from those subgroups. So for instance, if you were taking the student body at school, you could subdivide that by grade levels, freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior, and then randomly take from each of those groups people. So now we're going to take a look at some methods of sampling and identify which method we're using. In this case, we've got every fifth person walking out of a movie theater is asked to name their favorite type of movie, and we want to classify these as a simple. This is another word for random. That's a simple sampling. Systematic, self-selected, convenience, or stratified. So every fifth person corresponds to a systematic search where members are selected according to that specific interval. In this next one, we have visitors to a website are asked to complete a questionnaire about their favorite aspects of that site and what could be done to improve it. So once again, we're talking simple, which is very random, systematic, self-selected, convenience, or stratified. Now, in this case, our answer is going to be a convenience because people basically volunteered to be in that sample. Right? They showed up to the website and then they either chose to fill out the questionnaire or didn't choose. So it was convenient for them because it's just the people who visit their site. Next, we talk about something called bias. And a bias is basically an error that results in misrepresenting the population you have. So if a sample favors one conclusion or another, the sample is called bias and the data is therefore deemed invalid. So let's say I have the student council surveys the students in one class to decide a theme for this spring dance. And we want to know if that sample is biased or unbiased and explain that reasoning. Well, in this case, since they're only sampling one class and those people aren't chosen at random, we call that a biased sample. So based on that class that they took, there might be a lot of people dissatisfied with that decision for a theme. If you have the Parents Association and they go out and survey the parents of every fifth students on the school roster to decide whether to hold a fundraiser, is that going to be biased or unbiased? Well, since it's every fifth student and they aren't necessarily pooling those people independently. It's unbiased, even though they're picking every fifth student, because everybody's got an equal chance of being that fifth person. So now, after the samples are selected, then we're going to collect the data, and there's a lot of ways to collect data. 3 that we're going to talk about today. One is a survey, okay, where the data is collected by responses given to a specific person. You often get people out there surveying you. An example would be to determine whether student body members are happy with the spring dance theme. The dance committee asks a sample of students for their opinion. So a questionnaire, if you will. There's an observational study which could take place as a method of gathering data, where members of the sample are measured or observed without being affected. So, for instance, a gaming company brings in a bunch of people, sits them down in a room, and puts a bunch of games on the table and says, okay, go ahead and mess around. And then they observe them and find out which games are played the most. Experimental is where the sample is divided into 2 groups. One that undergoes some kind of a change and one that doesn't undergo a change. And then you compare and contrast what happened within those 2 groups. So for instance, a teacher gives a test 2 different ways, one by paper and pencil and one on the computer, and sees if there's any difference between the outcome of the 2 tests. So now we're going to describe some of these situations and determine whether the situation describes a survey, an observational study, or an experiment. We've got a retailer wanting to evaluate their performance in customer service, so they contact 1,000 random customers and ask if they would complete an evaluation form. We want to know if that's a survey, observational study, or experiment. Well, just by nature of contacting those 1,000 people, that's a survey, because they're asking them to fill out a form. They've actually bothered them. They aren't just observing them. If we have researchers analyzing the reactions of rats to a vitamin and compare them to those that don't receive that vitamin, then that's clearly an experiment, because some rats get the vitamin, some rats don't get the vitamin. So once again, that's experimental. Now, the design of a survey can introduce bias as well. Survey questions shouldn't do the following. They shouldn't be confusing. They shouldn't encourage one member of the sample to answer in a certain way. They shouldn't cause a strong reaction one way or another. And they shouldn't address more than one issue at one time. So we're going to take now and look at some of these questions and find out if they're biased or unbiased, depending on how the questions are asked. So in this first one, we asked, do you like basketball? And if so, do you prefer watching high school, college, or professional? Well, clearly in this problem, they've asked more than one question. So this is going to be a little biased because more than one question's been asked. Secondly, we'll ask people, how often do you exercise? We want to know if that's biased or unbiased. Well, if those 4 situations were the only thing we're going to use to determine bias and unbiased, this is clearly unbiased because it doesn't encourage people to answer a particular way. Let's do it again with this question. What do you think of the fabulous shopping center in town? If a person was to ask you that, they've kind of led you in a direction that they want you to answer because of this concept of fabulous shopping center. That word fabulous makes the interviewee kind of become manipulated because they're telling you this thing is fabulous, so they want you to answer, oh, it's great. So that's biased. So those were the terminologies we're going to use today. You got to kind of decide between the two. I know it's somewhat subjective, but that is statistics in some sense. Make sure you write your answers to these in the survey form, and we'll discuss more tomorrow.